Right. Good evening and welcome. My name's Susan Walker. I'm the chair of North East Humanists, and I will be running this meeting tonight. Before we get started, do a little bit of housekeeping. I'm running this as a bit of a blended meeting as an experiment, so there may be a few noises off because I've got people in my house with me at the moment as we're sharing the event together. But the rest of you, though, joining as you normally do, it's going to be the same as normal. Andy's going to give us his talk. Then we'll have a little bit of a break, a comfort break. And during that comfort break, I'd really encourage you to put any questions in the chat, whether you're on YouTube or you're on Zoom, and we will get through as many of those as we can after the break. I'm really looking forward to that. Well, that brings us to our main event. Now, I'm sure you, like me, have been totally horrified by just the amount of conspiracy theories that seem to have been out there over the past couple of years. I maybe have just been blind to them and haven't seen them, but it's horrifying, really, really horrifying. I don't understand myself how people who are really quite intelligent otherwise seem to succumb to things that are really ridiculous. And then I begin to worry that maybe I've succumbed to something that's really ridiculous, because I think I'm reasonably sensible most of the time. People may disagree, but that's what I feel like. I've always hoped that the solution to problems of this misthinking, as I've always thought of it, is as like teaching critical thinking skills rather. And that just doesn't seem to be cutting it. It doesn't seem to be working. It's a bit woolly. It's not what we think it is. Well, that brings me really nicely to Andy, our speaker, and you're going to have to excuse me because I'm going to have to read the potted bio I have of him because I just cannot remember all of it. There's a lot going on there. Andy Norman is the award-winning author of Mental Immunity. Highly recommend it. Excuse me for the noises off. Mental Immunity, Infectious Ideas, Mind-Parasites, and the Search for a Better Way to Think. His work has appeared in Scientific American, Psychology Today, Skeptic, Free Inquiry, and The Humanist. His research illuminates the evolutionary origins of human reasoning, the norms that make dialogue fruitful, and the workings of the mind's immune system. And he champions the emerging science of mental immunity as the antidote to disinformation, propaganda, hate, and division. He is the founder of Cognitive Immunology Research. He is the founder of the Cognitive Immunology Research Collaborative, a global think tank leading to the effort to inoculate humanity against cognitive contagion. I hope I got it all in there, Andy. So welcome, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Susan. Am I coming through okay?
You're coming in fine, yeah.
All right. I am seeing precisely. I'm actually getting a strange echo. That's better. Okay, great. So I'm actually seeing only my own face. Has everyone else turned off their video? I do like to see faces when I speak. I feel it feels like a more human transaction.
I'll just chip in there to say that what we found is it affects the Wi-Fi and the signal if we have lots of people streaming. So we ask people to keep their cameras switched off. So sorry about that. If you like, okay. I'll leave mine on so you can see me.
Okay, fair enough. So Susan mentioned that she's been horrified by the crazy conspiracy thinking going on, and I'm guessing she's not alone. I certainly share her just bafflement at the extraordinary credulity we're witnessing today, and it often feels to me like our world is going crazy. But it's actually this has felt true to me for about 30 years. So I've been actually trying to get at the root of the problem and wanted to share a few ideas that I think not just illuminate our crazy post-truth predicament, but also point to some really interesting countermeasures and remedies for the problem. So as a fellow humanist, you and I probably share the view that a lack of critical thinking skills lies at the root of this unhinged world that seems to be evolving these days. This is a crude depiction of that world, one in which misinformation and disinformation spread like at lightning speed around the world, causing people to deny COVID, to resist getting vaccinated, to say things like climate change is a hoax. Certainly here in America, it seems as though people's worldviews have hardened into ideologies that are dividing our nation in ways that are costing us enormous possibilities and diminishing our collective well-being. The political environment has become toxic. Fear and hate seem to be on the rise. This world that we've created actually seems to promote or feed extremism of various kinds. And I can think of no better example than this QAnon hypothesis that holds that a cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophiles controls the deep state in America, and that Donald Trump is going to save the world from this cabal. So there are many explanations. Well, we all know that this situation has caused enormous destruction. Not only have over 700,000 Americans succumbed to COVID, I believe it's now close to 140,000 Britons and close to 5 million of our fellow human beings. Much of this death could have been avoided by a more evidence-based approach to the pandemic. There's no shortage of explanations as to why we can't seem to control the flow of bad ideas that course through our culture. You ask some people, they'll say ignorance is at the root of it. Others will say that gullibility or deficits in critical thinking ability are the root cause of the situation we're in. Polarization and the cognitive biases, the tribal biases that triggers, that polarization triggers, certainly seem to contribute to the problem. There are now very sophisticated disinformation campaigns being waged by Russians and their bot farms. Some conjecture that social media is designed in such a way as to inflame our worst passions and bring out the worst in us, and that many of us occupy filter bubbles where we only get exposed to worldviews that are like ours, thereby driving our worldviews farther and farther apart. And of course, one very important question is whether the content algorithms that social media giants like Facebook, Twitter use to curate your information feed, what those are doing to your mind and to all of our minds. So there's no shortage of explanations, but I think that what our efforts to mitigate these problems have lacked is a critical piece of the puzzle. And I mean a rigorous empirical understanding of why some minds seem to filter out mis and disinformation almost effortlessly, while others really struggle and end up falling prey to it. In other words, why is it that the mind's filtration system sometimes works admirably well? And by filtration system, I mean idea filtration or information filtration system. Why is it that system sometimes works admirably well, and why does it so often fail? And can we find ways to strengthen the mind's idea filtration system? I want to tell you about an approach that I think both provides more insight into the problem and also some really exciting ideas for how we can combat this problem. I call it cognitive immunology. This is my own coinage, but it's essentially the emerging science of mental immunity. I'll say more about what I mean by that in a minute. It's basically, it's a science that's been around for many decades, but it's right now crystallizing in ways that are allowing many in the scientific establishment to see that it really offers us solutions. Here's the backstory. Back in the 1960s, an American psychologist named William McGuire began to study influence campaigns that the US military establishment felt were being used by Eastern Bloc countries against the West. And he discovered something really interesting. He found that the mind's information filtration system actually behaves like the body's immune system. In particular, he showed that if you expose a mind to a weakened form of an argument, and then disabuse people of the argument, then you can actually generate resistance even to stronger versions of the same argument in the minds that are so exposed. So McGuire noticed the analogy with inoculation. So in the same way that vaccines inject a weakened form of a virus, some vaccines inject a weakened form of a virus into your body, and your body actually learns how to generate antibodies to fight off even stronger versions of that virus. Turns out you can do something very similar with the mind. You can prime the mind in ways that cause it to essentially generate cognitive antibodies that fight off new information. This is what McGuire discovered. He called it inoculation theory. And for about 50, 60 years now, psychologists have been building on his findings. There was a curiously amoral quality to McGuire's work. He was interested in how do you inoculate minds against new information. But there's a new generation of inoculation theorists who are asking a different question, namely, how do we inoculate minds against bad information or misinformation? How do we inoculate minds against science denial and conspiracy thinking? Here are four ringleaders of that effort: John Cook, Sander van der Linden, Stefan Lewandowski, and Josh Compton. At least two of those are your countrymen and real leading thinkers in this field. And what I do in my book is generalize and expand on the foundational research that they have done. And I try to develop a rich set of conceptual tools for understanding and combating the spread of disinformation and other morally disorienting ideas. So let me give you the basic story here. Bad ideas are effectively mind parasites. They require a host. So a parasite requires a host. An idea requires a host. A parasite can harm its host. A bad idea can harm its host. A parasite can induce its host to spread it to other bodies, and a bad idea can induce its host to spread it to other minds. Think about proselytizing, for example, or a meme you encounter on Facebook that provokes you to share it with others. The second key principle here is that the mind actually has an immune system. Prior to the publication of my book, many people had noticed that the mind's filters actually behave as if they were an immune system. I'm making the stronger claim that it actually does have an immune system. So what does this mean? It means the mind has infrastructure for sifting through the ideas and the information that it comes upon and trying to spot and remove the ones that are at the very least harmful or threatening to the person in question. I actually think that the mind had to develop an immune system because the wrong ideas could get you killed in our ancestral past. A few things to note about mental immune systems that can function more or less well. Every single one of us has a mental immune system that functions at less than peak capacity. These systems have two basic jobs. One is to filter out bad information, bad ideas, and to let in good information or good ideas. And the trick is to do that is to balance those competing ends, those ends that are to some degree in tension with one another. So there are two ways in which a mental immune system can fail. It can let in a bad idea, or it can screen out a good idea. Turns out mental immune systems are finicky and corruptible. There are many ideas loose in our culture that actually disrupt or diminish the functioning of our minds. And many of us, I argue in the book, that many of us have actually, even the best educated humanists of the world have actually bought into some of the ideas that reduce the functioning of our mind's immune system. But just as a mind's immune system can become compromised or immune deficient, a mind's immune system can actually become, we can also learn to enhance them. So vaccines are tools for essentially educating the body's immune system, teaching the body's immune system how to spot harmful parasites, and allowing the immune system to do its work and eliminate the threat they pose. Turns out we can teach the mind's immune system how to spot bad ideas and thereby make people more discriminating and better critical thinkers. Only where the concept of critical thinking, I would argue, doesn't take us very far. It's a largely black box concept that people use to mean, oh, you know, the way we educated people like to think. Well, actually, pretty much everybody uses it to mean, oh, you know, the way I think. The way they think, that's uncritical. The way we think, that's critical. But I know, even though I've taught critical thinking for 25 years, I no longer believe that it's a particularly useful concept. I think the idea of mental immune health is a far more, is a concept that illuminates the phenomenon with much greater clarity. And in principle, it should allow us to take critical thinking instruction to a whole, and the practice of critical thinking to new heights. Oops. So to illustrate a key fact about mental immune systems, let me tell you the 100% factual, non-fake news tale of Fred the Flat Earther. So Fred dies and goes to heaven, and he marches into God's inner sanctum and says, God, I've been a flat earther my entire life. Now that I'm here, I just have to ask, is the world flat or is it round? God looks at him and says, Fred, I'm sorry to say this, but the world is very round. Fred looks back at God, and his face registers recognition, and he says, this conspiracy goes higher than I thought. Fred has a mental immune disorder. In fact, it's an autoimmune disorder of the mind. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of autoimmunity. Immunologists talk about an overactive immune system. When the body's immune system is triggered into hyperactive mode, it will often attack the body's own tissues, resulting in serious health issues. Well, it turns out that the mind's immune system can also become hyperactive and question things that we have no business questioning. Now, I happen to question God's existence, as I imagine many of you do, but I don't question the shape the scientific consensus on the shape of the world. I think Fred's doubts about the Earth's sphericality represent an autoimmune overreaction. A friend of mine is a philosopher of science who went undercover at a flat Earth convention, and he spoke with many flat earthers to try to figure out how they think and how we can think better. He just published a book. His name is Lee McIntyre. He just published a book called How to Talk to a Science Denier. But one thing he discovered is that flat earthers are not just uniformly gullible. In fact, they regard us as gullible for accepting things they don't take at face value. So we look at their views about flat Earth and say, how could you be so gullible? They look at our views about the spherical Earth and say, how could you guys be so gullible? The fact is they're asking questions that you've never thought to ask. They're being more critical than you are about some things. They're being more skeptical than we are about many things. But I would argue that they aren't being skeptical or critical about the right things. It turns out to be really bad advice to tell people, just be more skeptical, just be more critical. When we dispense that kind of advice in higher education, as higher education has for many, many years, people go out into the world and they start raising fatuous questions about the idea that the Earth is spherical, and they end up going down rabbit holes. The trick is to be critical or skeptical about the right things to the right degree at the right time in the right way. And standard critical thinking instruction just doesn't even begin to give people useful guidance on that question. So Fred is not alone. There are tens of millions of my countrymen who have gone down conspiracy rabbit holes or been succumbed to political ideologies that warp their thinking in various ways. And I think this is the sign that many mental immune systems have been compromised by disinformation. As I show in the book, it's also the case that we've been neglecting and abusing our culture's immune system for decades. Cultures have mechanisms for preventing the spread of bad information, and they can fail just as mental immune systems can fail. And when you buy into ideas like everyone is entitled to their opinion and thereby provide everyone with a convenient excuse for believing whatever they like, turns out you're weakening mental immune systems. When you teach people that values are subjective or ultimately arbitrary, you're actually teaching people not to inquire. You're actually teaching people that it's pointless to inquire as to to seek a deeper understanding of right and wrong. So there are many ideas like this coursing through our culture that actually weaken mental immune systems. I call them mental immune disruptors, and argue that every single one of us can do a better job of helping to remove these immune disruptive ideas from the meme pool and thereby promoting human welfare. Now, you might think that let me mention a third element of the main idea here. I've mentioned the bad ideas can be viewed as mind-parasites, that the mind's filters or critical thinking can be thought of as an immune system. It turns out that doubts are the antibodies of the mind. Some of you may remember from a high school science class that a guy named Ilya Mechnikov, a Russian zoologist, stabbed a starfish larva with a thorn, stuck it under a microscope, and watched as white blood cells swarmed to the scene of the injury and trying to neutralize the tip of the thorn. He was the first human being ever to witness the body's immune system in action. And he conjectured that white blood cells are actually antibodies that function to fight off perceived threats. Well, our minds also generate antibodies. Doubts are the antibodies of the mind, but so are challenges, objections, and critical questions of one kind or another. And it's important to educate the mind's immune system so that it generates the right antibodies at the right time. So you might think this is mere metaphor. It's not. I've come to see it as a powerful lens that brings stunning clarity to issues that epistemologists, philosophers have struggled to gain clarity about for thousands of years. I've been studying scientific revolutions since the mid-1980s, how they happen, why they happen. And one thing I've learned is that there are many signs that a really significant scientific revolution is brewing right here in our time. Think about how the revelation that the world is full of microbes. And the Dutch microscopist focused his crude microscopes on pond scum and blood, and he discovered a world teeming with microbial life. And in the immediate aftermath of that discovery, the germ theory of disease really began to spread through Europe. And before long, it completely changed our approach to medicine. And of course, immunology, the science of how the body's immune system worked, has also helped us understand human health, and it saved literally billions of human lives. I actually think that cognitive immunology is comparable in some ways to the germ theory of disease, and the science of bodily immunology. I think it's going to fundamentally change our relationship to the tiny things that parasitize our minds and help us win back a degree of autonomy from the ideas that so often warp minds and fracture societies. So I invite you to take a look through this lens. My book is a nice way to, I think, to see what the world looks like through the lens of cognitive immunology. You'll start to see mind parasites, mental immune disruptors, mental immune disorders, mental immune boosters, and you'll actually start to see that it's possible to inoculate minds against some of the worst forms of cognitive contagion. Here's some of the things we now know. And by we, I mean people who do research in this domain. Infodemics are real. The World Health Organization just declared that infodemics are every bit as real as pandemics, and that they're a very serious threat to public health. And that governments around the world need to develop infodemic mitigation strategies just as they develop pandemic mitigation strategies. I'm working with a couple of scholars in Holland and Belgium who have discovered that the spread of witchcraft beliefs in early modern Europe is best understood as a kind of cognitive contagion. That the idea that there are witches among us that are causing our crops to fail, ideas like that are actually best thought of as mind parasites, that we can understand historical phenomena like that better through the lens of information epidemiology. I no longer think critical thinking is enough. I think critical thinking instruction as it's existed, the concept's been around for about 100 years. And if today's world is any indication, it's not even close to doing enough to prevent bad ideas from spreading. We now know that it's easier to prevent a mind infection than to cure one. As we like to say, pre-bunking is easier than debunking. Or as I like to say sometimes, an ounce of mind inoculation is worth a pound of cult deprogramming. So if you can figure out how to pre-bunk against a bad idea that's just beginning to spread, you can head off a lot of trouble. It is possible, it turns out, to help people climb out of conspiracy rabbit holes, but it's hard to do, and it requires time, effort, and you have to win the person's trust to do it. Some of you may remember that Donald Trump's crony, Steve Bannon, once described the campaign's approach to information, its approach to marketing his candidacy. He basically said, we flood the zone with shit. What he means by this is that if you flood enough bad information through Facebook, the way the Trump campaign did through Cambridge Analytica, you can actually cause many of your targets to reach the point where they're so cynical they don't even believe there is such a thing as truth anymore. You can actually manufacture cynicism. You can actually manufacture nihilism with the right disinformation strategy. And the key to combating strategies like that is to help people develop strong immunity to disinformation and propaganda. Turns out that belonging to a community of inquiry, I'm guessing that your Northeast Humanist group likes to get together and think together, ask questions together. If so, you belong to a community of inquiry. It turns out that such belonging is one of the best things you can do to strengthen your mind's immune system. As a fellow humanist, I'm guessing you suspect that belief-based religious identities can close your minds. We now know the mechanism for this. The Yale psychologist Dan Kahan says that all human beings show signs of what he calls identity protective cognition, which means that if you hitch your identity to a set of beliefs and then challenges or questions to those beliefs come along, you tend to get defensive. You feel threatened by these questions and often react, actually often overreact, because your mind's immune system is being triggered to overreact. So it's actually a good idea to teach children not to hitch their identities to any set of beliefs, and instead to hitch their identities to the ideal of honest inquiry. And I think one of the great glories of humanism as a philosophy is that it essentially teaches people to do just that. Okay, I'm going to try to wrap up here in a little bit. Susan mentioned earlier on that I now direct a research institute. We call it the Cognitive Immunology Research Collaborative. Along with our partners, we're bringing together experts in this domain. We're mapping the largest threats, disinformation threats that are out there. We're modeling infodemics and working out how we can disrupt infodemics. We're actually working on a set of basic principles of cognitive hygiene in the same way that learning how to wash our hands has saved hundreds of millions of lives. Some very simple behaviors can probably help us gain a degree of independence from the mind parasites that otherwise course through social networks. So we're working on a project where we're actually going to develop the principles of cognitive hygiene and try to get them out so that teachers and parents everywhere can begin to equip people with these basic tools. In my book, I argue that the famous Socratic method, right? So Socrates ran around questioning ideas and testing those ideas with questions. I think that's one of the most powerful and interesting mind inoculants ever invented. And in the book, I take it and I refine it into something that you might call a mind vaccine. I'd love to actually test my mind vaccine, and I'm looking for some collaborators to help me run an empirical test as to its effectiveness. But some of my colleagues in this space are gamifying media literacy, they're basically designing games that kids can play that raise their awareness of all of the people out there who are trying to deceive them and get them to believe bad, wrong things. I also think that the principles of cognitive immunology need to be built into the design of social media environments, so that the tremendous amounts of time and attention people spend on these social media platforms can actually be used to strengthen our mind's immune systems and pro-social attitudes rather than the reverse. So I'd leave you with this question. What can you do to help bring about the cognitive immunology revolution? If it's anything like the original immunology revolution, it could make our children's future and our grandchildren's future much, much better than the world we inhabit today. I hope you'll join me in helping to bring about the cognitive immunology revolution so that cognitive contagion doesn't blight our children and our grandchildren's world.
Hello again, and welcome back. It's lots of questions. I'm going to start by going to the YouTube. I've got one question from YouTube first, then I'm going to go into the room, and then I'm going to go on to Zoom. So if people are out there waiting for their question, it depends where you've asked the question. So I've got one from Roland to start with, and he says, immunology provides a good way to visualize the problem, but how does one determine what is a bad and a good idea if not through critical thinking? And I think that was something you did get onto a bit in your book, didn't you?
Yeah, thank you. Do I need to start by apologizing for failing to share my slides? Did they not come through?
No, the slides didn't come through. Sorry.
Oh gosh, guys, I am sorry. Relatively. I am getting that echo again, Susan. I don't know what you did.
All right, I think that's because I've got my speaker on. I'll switch my speaker off while you're speaking.
All right, thank you. Okay, yeah, that helps. So yes, I'm sorry, who posed this question?
Roland.
Roland, thank you,
on
Roland.
YouTube.
Yep. Roland correctly identifies what may be the central philosophical question for anybody with a project of like mine. Yeah, I think it's really important that we be able to speak frankly about bad ideas. And the question we have to ask then is, what makes an idea good or bad? So I actually think that the answer here is fairly straightforward. Basically, ideas can have many properties, some of them logical, some of them causal in the sense that if you believe in them and then act on them, they have predictable impact on the world. So pretty much everybody will agree to, I think, the following principles. All else being equal, truth is a good quality in an idea. All else being equal, falsehood is a bad quality in an idea. Being well evidenced is a good quality. Being poorly evidenced is a bad one. Being useful is a good quality. Being counterproductive or conducive to dysfunction is a bad quality in an idea. So I think we can look at ideas and rather than use the term bad idea to mean idea I happen to dislike, instead we can use it to mean idea that on careful reflection, we can see to have problematic properties. So honest inquiry into the properties that ideas have can actually reveal the considerations that make them good or bad, or the properties that make them good or bad. And philosophers for a long time have been saying, you know what, guys, we need to stop treating the goodness or badness of ideas as completely subjective or in the eyes of the beholder, and instead buckle down and really start investigating the actual qualities of ideas that in some ways are independent of just the way we feel about them. And if you adopt that practice, you can actually start to speak about ideas that are objectively good or bad. Think about the history of the idea that violence is the answer. That's an enormously destructive idea. Ideas that incite people to violence, they're bad for their causal implications. Other ideas are bad because they're poorly evidenced or because they're just plain false. So the basic criteria that determines the goodness and badness of ideas are commonly understood. And what really needs to happen is that we just need to engage in the kind of inquiry where we look at those qualities and then begin to categorize the ideas as either helpful or problematic, good or bad, true or false.
All right, thank you. That's I was really interested in your ideas of sort of the downstream effects of ideas as well when I was reading about that, and I think that comes in. And I hadn't really, I'd always considered evidence is really important. I'm a scientist by training, and that the downstream ideas that was the effects, I think, was
Thank
sort of new to me.
For mentioning that, Susan. I'll just sketch that idea for those who haven't had the chance to read the book yet. But we in the West come out of a philosophical tradition that has basically argued that the upstream evidence in support of a belief are what make it either reasonable or not. But the pragmatist tradition in philosophy basically came along and said, you know what, the downstream consequences of our beliefs matters too, and they also factor in to suitably comprehensive idea evaluation. So we need to look at both upstream evidence and downstream consequences, I think, to be to become truly wise.
Thank you for that. Eileen, who's in the room with me, you've got a question.
Yeah, it's just around how does emotion play into this concept, and I think somebody has it in the Zoom chat around self-esteem. That's what I'm getting. That's what I'm thinking. How does somebody's emotions?
Yeah, boy, I think the story here is too complicated. So I'm not sure where to begin. Well, emotions can clearly cloud our judgment. That's not an uncommon observation. But I don't think that objectivity requires being completely dispassionate. I don't think we should even strive to be completely dispassionate. I think that emotions have a role to play in good thinking. Anytime you assess the goodness or badness of something, you start with intuitions about its goodness or badness, and those intuitions are arguably generated by something like emotion. The trick is to neither dismiss the evidence that emotion provides as valueless, nor to treat it as sacred and unchallengeable, because often our intuitions and our emotions mislead. So you can't always take them at face value. I think it's often appropriate to take your emotional reactions to things into consideration as input into deliberation and idea testing, but they should never be the final word either.
Thank you for that. Going over now, a question from Ed. He asks, can you tell us more about the history of cognitive immunology and how did the 4 pioneers test this? He says, presumably we don't have antibodies that we know how to see yet.
Right. So, well, to the extent that doubts are the antibodies of the mind, we experience them very directly. We see them in the sense that we can actually watch them form in our own minds when a questionable claim comes along. Somebody makes a questionable claim, questions pop into our minds. that I would argue is the phenomenological or the experiential side of the mind's immune system reacting to the new information. Is that evidence? Perhaps of a kind. It's I don't for a moment think that I can identify the physical substrate underneath either mind parasites or so bad ideas are encoded in some way in the mind, but they're not a materially independent entity from the brain structures that embody it. And I would argue that the same is true for antibodies, that this is true generally of information, of any phenomenon that is kind of rooted in information. Our beliefs are encoded brain states, right? Our desires are brain states. And yes, you can analyze them as ultimately built on brain states. But we don't have to wait until the brain has been completely and thoroughly analyzed to begin talking about mental immune systems and mental antibodies. Because, hey, we talk about beliefs and desires, even though we don't know exactly how they're encoded in the brain either. They turn out to be useful concepts. As far as the history, more about the history of cognitive immunology, on the telling I gave you 20 minutes ago, William McGuire's work in the 50s and 60s was kind of what got cognitive immunology going. But once you kind of understand the basic principles of cognitive immunology, you can actually view the entire history of epistemology, sort of cognitive immunology in embryo. When philosophers seek wisdom and try to combat foolishness, they're basically trying to filter out bad ideas and help people fill their minds with good ones. I argue that philosophy's quest to distinguish knowledge from mere opinion or reasonable beliefs from unreasonable beliefs is fundamentally an exercise in mind purification, in cognitive hygiene. So you can go back and interpret many works in epistemology as proto efforts in cognitive immunology. So cognitive immunology is in some ways just a metaphor that is proving suddenly, that has gradually proved more and more useful. And we've reached a point now where it's become so useful that I think the language is going to transform from metaphorical to literal. So think about the way in which the term gene, the concept of a gene, went from being something everybody assumed was a mere metaphor to something scientists accept now as memes really exist because the concept proved too useful. I think the same thing's going to happen with concepts like mental immune disruptor and mental immune disorder and mental immune system. I hope that's a adequate answer, Ed. I know your thinking on this subject goes much deeper, and I'm sure there's a lot more I would need to say to satisfy you on that, but I am seeing some questions in the chat here that have been waiting here for a bit. Should I address a couple of Kate Hinton's questions?
Yes, you may. Otherwise, I'll just nip in there and ask them.
Yeah, well, why don't you pose it then, and I'll try to address that. I've been thinking about one of Kate's here.
So from Kate, she says, humanists in the UK are not normally anti-religious or critical of religious practices unless they deny human rights. It sounds as if you would be more critical because of people with a strong faith may then need to defend their beliefs. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, that's a really nice question, and I think that is true. You're picking up correctly, Kate, on a view that. So, I don't like to think of myself as anti-religious, and I try to treat my religious brothers and sisters with full respect in every way that I can. At the same time, I think the idea that it's a good thing to believe things on faith can objectively harm the mind's immune system. So when you develop the habit of believing things because you want them to be true, or believing things because some authority figure said they're true, or believing things because your faith tradition says it's a virtue to believe them, all of those habits of mind can actually compromise a mind's immune system. There's some research now out of Canada from a team led by Gordon Pennycook that shows that when the idea that your beliefs should change in response to evidence is compromised by, say, the idea that faith is a virtue, that you then become more susceptible to conspiracy thinking, more susceptible to science denial, more susceptible to divisive ideologies. In the book, I call the idea that we have an obligation to modify our beliefs in response to the evidence. I call that belief reason's fulcrum, because without that, reasons cannot educate us, cannot make us more enlightened. And I worry that religion has a harmful effect on our mind's immune systems. And I'm imploring my religious brothers and sisters to rethink the idea that it's a good thing to teach children to identify with a set of extremely questionable beliefs. I think you're setting them up for, when you do that to a child, you're often setting them up to feel extremely defensive when people raise very sensible questions later in life. And that's not a good way, I think, to raise people who can really think critically.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I'll ask Kate's follow-up question while we're here, because it's sort of, you were talking about raising children in religion, and this sort of ties in. Philosophy for Children, it's an education program in the UK. I presume there's something very similar in the States. Have you come across something like that, and do you think it provides a model of it for community inquiry?
Yeah, I have come across it, and I think it's a marvelous initiative. I believe it's a few decades old now. Here in the States, there's a guy in, I think it's New Jersey, who really is an evangelist for philosophy for children. I'm blanking on his name at the moment. But yeah, so imagine, you know how many elementary school classrooms have like a story rug, like a round rug where everybody sits around cross-legged and somebody will read a story or tell a story, or you can have a conversation. I think it's a wonderful thing to bring kids together around a rug like that and ask them fundamentally philosophical questions. What do you think would really be fair, little Johnny? You know, if Jamie broke the rules to help somebody, did she do something wrong? If so-and-so followed the rules but ended up hurting somebody, did he do the right thing? Right? Very simple philosophical questions like this can really get kids excited about thinking and help to train their minds, I think, to be much more sensitive. You can, if fairly early you learn to ask and process and philosophical questions, I think that can come back later in life and result in greater resistance to mind parasites. So I'm a big fan, yes, of philosophy for children.
Me too. I don't think there's enough of it about. Let's go back to some of the other questions. We've got one here, which I believe it says from Liz, but I believe it's actually from Ron Armstrong. How does the fact that scientific ideas, which are laughed at when they first appear, but subsequently become part of the scientific orthodoxy, fit in with your analysis. And I can think of things like you mentioned hand washing. That was, when that was first introduced, that was laughed at.
Mhm.
So where are you going with
Yeah.
that one?
Yeah, and so one of the neat things about science is that it has this concept of a hypothesis. And when a scientist wants to float an idea, but not assert an idea, they have this nifty thing they can do. They can say, this is an idea I think is worth examining, and I want to start testing to see whether it's true. I'm going to treat it as a hypothesis. That's a wonderful kind of way to create a staging ground where an idea can either prove its merits or not, or fail to. So I think one thing that good philosophers do is anytime they raise a question about anything, they treat it as a hypothesis and start testing that hypothesis. Much of the best philosophy, I think, is fundamentally hypothesis testing. A lot of it can happen in the armchair, using the ideas you already have on board, but there's no reason why we can't integrate, empirical evidence into such idea testing as well. And so I think philosophy and science are sort of kindred enterprises with an attempt to filter out bad ideas and find good ones. I have to admit, think about, there were many, many, many good reasons to hang on to the geocentric model of the solar system when Galileo came along and tried to promote the sun-centered or Copernican model of the solar system. At what point in that conversation did it become rational to switch from being a geocentrist to a heliocentrist? That's a really hard question, and I don't know the answer. I know that Galileo was brilliant in his demonstrations of the truth of the Copernican model, but I don't think cognitive immunology gives us any easy answers to questions like that. But it's fascinating to think about how science works through major conflicts like that, and often comes out with better models of the world.
Thank you. Yes. Next question. This one's from Mike Turner. If Steve Bannon was so successful in flooding social media with disinformation, can we do the same by mass flooding with real information, genuine information?
Nice question. So I think the answer is no. You can't simply overwhelm bad information with sheer quantity of good information. One of the reasons is that a mind primed with disinformation or primed with an ideology will often just dismiss or filter out the good information after it comes in. Here's a real example from my life. I was raised in a family that practically worshipped Martin Luther King. And later in life, I actually heard that Martin Luther King was unfaithful to his wife. Now, I did not want to believe this. And I immediately jumped to the conclusion that this must be one of the rumors circulated by J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, to smear Martin Luther King. Now, that was pure invention on my part. It was my mind's immune system trying to fight off information that it perceived as a threat. And it misled me. So we have to become sensitive to the ways in which our minds overreact to information and learn how to modulate our mental immune response to things.
Thank you. I've got a question here from Phil. Is it possible to have a sensible conversation with someone who is very close, who has become a victim of conspiracy theories, without falling out with them?
So the evidence on this is, I think, beginning to pile up. The answer is yes, it's possible to. Let me tell you a story. I don't know if you guys have heard of the man named Daryl Davis. He's a Black blues musician who has single-handedly deconverted over 100 Klansmen, Ku Klux Klansmen, by basically sitting down with them over a beer, listening to them, letting them spew their crazy ideas about race, and then very patiently raising objections in ways that show humanity and respect. He's actually had several high-ranking Klansmen leave the organization as a result of the conversations they had with him and give him their cloak and hood as a way of saying thank you for having rescued me from the white supremacist rabbit hole that they had fallen down. It is possible to deprogram somebody who's fallen in with a cult, but it's hard. It requires patiently building trust. It takes time. It takes effort. I think the same is true if you're trying to deconvert your crazy uncle who's fallen in with QAnon, or who's fallen in with a toxic political ideology that makes them angry all the time. I tried to have a conversation like this with actually another blues musician when I was out in Montana not too long ago. And I just tried to keep my cool, maintain respect, acknowledge it when he made a reasonable point, and also just kind of ask him, hey, can you hear this? Do you think it's possible that this might be true as well? I didn't end up convincing him that COVID is a giant hoax. That was his belief, and I didn't succeed in it. But we did have a remarkably constructive conversation for about an hour, and perhaps I left him with a few thoughts that will come back to him later and help him shed what I think of as some really harmful ideas.
Well, let's hope so. Right, this one's from Moira. It's back to children. She's worried about children being manipulated via social media. How would you build in safeguards to social media to stop children sort of going down the rabbit hole?
Wow, I wish I had an easy answer to that. I'm only beginning to think about this problem. My expertise is in facilitating constructive, collaborative inquiry on fundamentally divisive questions. So philosophers think hard about the nature of right and wrong, or whether faith can be reconciled with the demands of reason. And these are the kind of questions around which ideologies form and which often divide people. And when you're in charge of running a classroom inquiry, that a constructive dialogue about these issues, you learn how to have those conversations in ways that are non-threatening, that create a safe learning environment where people can test their own ideas and hazard arguments and see how they work out. Forgive me, I may have forgotten the gist of the question. What was take me back, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I'm on mute there. It was Moira asking about what safeguards you put into social media for children.
Yeah. So I think I know a bit about how to facilitate constructive conversations in person. What lessons can we take from that, or what lessons can we take from the science of cognitive immunology to redesign social media environments? Well, for one thing, it seems like a mistake to have content creation algorithms that just maximize the amount of time people spend on the platform. So we know, for example, that the algorithms that artificial intelligence has generated for Twitter, for example, actually maximize the amount of time people spend on the platform. And often what gets them to spend an hour or two is divisive content, and that basically ropes people into a trolling contest. We know that doesn't bring out the best in people. We know that that leaves people angry and bitter. We know that it makes people feel alienated. We know that it makes people despair. These are not the psychological effects we want to have on young people or on people in general. And we need to redesign these platforms to bring out the best in us rather than the worst of us. And I wish I had a more specific answer for you, Moira, but I'm afraid I haven't given that question enough thought yet.
Right, thank you for that. I'm jumping through, there's a few questions. Sorry, I muted myself there when I unmuted myself as well. There are a few questions that are quite similar, so I'm not going through everyone's questions because I think we've covered a lot of the stuff. But I would like to go to Derek's idea here. Do you think that misinformation and conspiracy theories are gaining ground because of a vacuum of good ideas? Is what we're witnessing due to a decline in ideology and therefore crazy ideas and a cult of celebrity takes over? So are all these crazy ideas moving into a vacuum?
That's an interesting hypothesis. So we know that religiosity is in steep decline around much of the world. And many religions provide kind of a framework for how to think about essential questions about right and wrong, or how societies should be organized, and how we should live. And it could be that the loss of those traditions is leaving people rootless and unstable and in search of answers, and maybe they can just latch on to half-baked alternatives that they find on the internet. I wouldn't dismiss that hypothesis at all. I think there's something to that. I think that ideologies tend to close minds. At least the way I define the concept of an ideology, ideologies are best dissolved and left behind. But we do need ways to anchor our identity. I think each and every one of us needs to answer the question, who am I? And that means, and often we seek answers in the groups we belong to. It's important to belong. It's important to feel like you matter. And we need to spread ideas that satisfy those needs, but without triggering the kind of toxic tribalism. I mean, it's great to celebrate an us, but it's not so good to demonize them. And how do you celebrate us without demonizing them? That's got to be a big part of the problem there.
Yes, I agree. We've had something I've been remiss in saying, with lots of people on YouTube and in the room and on the Zoom have been thanking you for the talk because it's very good, and I add that. One last question, it's from Tony, but I'm going to paraphrase it slightly because you probably don't know the history of what's going on locally. In the northeast of England, there is a football team called Newcastle United, and they have just been bought out by somebody from Saudi Arabia. And I do not follow football, but I do know that the people who have bought this football club, there are issues with the human rights violations that are going on in Saudi Arabia, and these issues are linked. So a lot of people are very unhappy about this locally. But when it was announced in Newcastle, a lot of the fans were so pleased that all this money was coming into their club. They were running around celebrating, dressing how they thought Saudis should look, not in a good way. Do you think there's any way where people have this disconnect between what's good for them and what's bad for the the greater society. So all of these awful human rights abuses going on in Saudi Arabia, but they're giving us money. So whoopee, they're our friends.
Yeah.
What would you say about that?
Yeah, well, I can certainly understand passion for one's local football team. Here in America, football means something a little different, and I have a weakness for my city's American football team. And I have to confess, I mean, I think the game of American football is exacting a terrible toll on the bodies and the brains of those who participate. And my own wife is basically saying I should give up my fandom because it's not ethically defensible to continue watching games when I know that the participants are being maimed. She's not wrong. And yet I suffer weakness of will whenever I try to turn off the television whenever the games are on. So I understand the passions that might be buffeting Newcastle fans. I think it's really important also that we take a stand against the human rights abuses that Bin Salman, for example. I mean, his execution of Jamal Khashoggi was despicable, and there are many other ways in which Saudi Arabia is harming human rights, the human rights of women, the human rights of the people in neighboring Yemen. And it's really important that people take a stand against that. But I wouldn't presume to instruct your Newcastle fans as to what they should do. I don't have any easy answers there.
That is probably wise. I'm going to give the final question to Ed, and I'm going to also sort of put my own little twist into it. One of the reasons I own your book is because you're giving us a talk, and it was already in my wish list because Waterstones had put it in there, and I think you will like this book because of the books you read. So you are in my little bubble. So I'm reading your book and I'm really enjoying it, and I haven't quite finished it yet, but I will do soon. Great book, and it follows on a lot of other philosophy type books that I'm reading because I'm scientist trained. I'm trying to teach myself a little bit of philosophy. Brilliant. It's being received really well by me. Ed's question, to follow on from my statement, is how has your book been received by sort of people like his Trump voting mum? Do they enjoy your work? Have you made any converts? Because I'm an easy please, really, for you.
Right. Yeah, I don't think he meant my Trump voting mom, because my mom didn't and wouldn't have. But yeah, I
Ed's
understand.
mum.
Oh, Ed's mom. Yeah, I see. Gotcha. I have received exactly one kind of bit of hate mail about my book. And it basically said, your book sounded really promising. I started reading it, but as soon as I got to the part where you used Trump as an example of deranged thinking, he said, I sent the book back to Amazon and demanded a refund. So that was the one bit of strongly negative feedback I've gotten on the book. Much of the feedback has been really positive. Many more people have basically said, you know, I was almost despairing about the possibility of constructive dialogue between the left and the right in my country. And your book lays out a framework where we can actually do that again. That if we follow your counsel, Andy, on how we can actually work through these issues in a rational way, you know, we could heal our country. And people who are very far from where I stand on the political spectrum have met me there and said, yes, I completely endorse this idea that genuine dialogue is the correct way to test ideas, and that we should be having these conversations again, because you know what? In this screen-mediated world, we're just not having the kind of real searching inquiries and dialogues that we need to heal our divisions. So the basic prescription seems to be congenial to many people on the right, but I don't have any examples of Trump supporters who've been magically transformed. I wish I could count a number of those, but that's probably more than the book can accomplish in a few short months. Give me a century or two, Ed. I'll sort it all out. I just need a couple hundred years.
Oh, we'll hold you to that. Centuries time, we'll all be back here and have this conversation again. Right, I think we've covered, I think, most of the topics of all of the questions that are there.